Hello and welcome to Outward, Slate's LGBTQ podcast. I'm Bryan Louder, an editor at Slate. Biden is out, Kamala is brat, and I don't know about you, but I sure am feeling a lot more hopeful about the future of these United States than I was a week ago. But that hope depends on the Democrats and voters fending off a Republican takeover of the government in November, because that result would not only mean a second Trump presidency, but also the beginning of something called Project 2025, unchecked by a corrupt Supreme Court. If you haven't noticed that mysterious phrase, the goals and proposals laid out within represent a truly radically and finally getting the light out about and the authoritarian. It's a 920-page document put together under the on everything from reproductive rights, heritage foundation, taxes, the environment, lays out a day one policy plan for the next Republican. Don't worry, the architects of Project 2025 didn't forget about Vance and trans people or someone else, and a GOP-led Congress unchecked by a corrupt Supreme Court. The goals and proposals laid out within Project 2025 are a truly radical remaking of American life in the authoritarian Christian nationalist mold, on everything from reproductive rights and divorce to taxes, the environment, immigration, and education. And don't worry, the architects of Project 2025 didn't forget about queer and trans people. In fact, they have some particularly vile things in store for us. To help us understand those plans and what they would mean for our community if they come to fruition, we're joined today by Orion Rummler. Orion is the lead LGBTQ+ reporter at the 19th, and he focuses on state politics, breaking news, and the underreported ways that trans and queer people are marginalized. He previously covered breaking news for Axios and contributed research to Axios on HBO. He recently co-bylined a Project 2025 explainer with Amanda Becker and Dariana Davis for the 19th, titled What You Need to Know About Project 2025. I'm grateful to have him on the show today to tell us just that. We'll be back to talk with Orion after a short break. All right, we are back. Orion, welcome to Outward. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Bryan.
So I gave our listeners a sort of a brief description at the top of the show, but why don't we start by you just telling them and all of us about what Project 2025 is generally, who's involved, sort of how it came to be. I know it's been around for a while, like you could get the PDF, I think like a year ago, but it's, recently we've all started paying a lot more attention. So just give us that general overview to start.
Yeah, so I was first reading some of this last October.
Right.
So yeah, it's been a minute. But so this is, like you said, it's a policy playbook meant for the country's next Republican president, written by the Heritage Foundation. It lays out a far-right Christian vision for Donald Trump's second White House term if he wins in November. And if you haven't heard of the Heritage Foundation till now, this is a conservative think tank. It's shaped the GOP's agenda for decades. They've been a force behind the scenes for state-level anti-LGBTQ bills for a while. They advise states on these issues. A recent story by the Washington Post, they had one of their senior legal fellows describing like how the organization wants to change its approach to anti-LGBTQ bills in response to some of these bills failing to become law this year. So, that's some background on what the Heritage Foundation is. And, there's a lot of unifying themes through Project 2025. One of the big ones that's relevant to us is a focus on protecting the idea of the nuclear family, meaning a man and a woman who have children.
Yeah, that's true. That is definitely one of the themes. You mentioned the Heritage Foundation. Is it true also that I think there are a number of other groups that sort of like consulted on it? And it's really, I looked at that list when editing something else a while ago, and it's really a roll call of kind of terrifying people, right?
Yeah. And so for me, when we were writing this explainer, when we were looking at who was authoring it, one of the things that stood out to me was identifying how many of the authors were former Trump advisors or had formerly worked with the former president on his campaign or advising him. And that's important because Trump has publicly put out a statement to distance himself from Project 2025.
Yeah.
But we know that his own former advisors and former campaign staff worked on this project. And I think for our discussion, one of the names that matters the most is Roger Ciravino, and he authored the section on the Department of Health and Human Services.
Before we get into sort of digging into the specifics of Project 2025, I thought it would be worth clarifying how this thing actually relates to government. You called it a playbook or sort of policy proposals. It's not like legally binding, right? Why did the Heritage Foundation invest so much energy and pages, 920 pages in this thing? I know that they've sort of done this thing called, I think, a mandate for leadership for a long time. So what's their investment in doing something like this in the first place?
But as you pointed out, these are like what they're proposing. It's not anything a future president would have to follow.
Right.
I mean, if Trump or, if he became president and if he wanted to maintain relationships with people who authored this thing, then I assume he would. But just because Heritage Foundation proposes all these things doesn't mean they would happen automatically. However, a lot of what the Heritage Foundation proposes for LGBTQ people matches Trump's own policy proposals. So there is some overlap we can point to say that the Trump campaign is probably on the same page for a lot of this, just based on comparing them. And something else to note about the practicality of this is that when I was talking with LGBTQ advocates about a possible future Trump administration and Project 2025, they noted that a lot of what's proposed in here would not be able to happen without Congress. So that's something else to think about. Although Trump has said I forget the exact phrasing, but on day one, like he referenced something like he wouldn't be a dictator except on day one.
Right. That's the quote.
He said he wants to do a lot on his own, but he can't do all this on his own. So that's something else to note.
Yeah, so let's dig into, this is a LGBT show, so we're going to sort of focus on that part, even though there's a ton in Project 2025 to be upset about. You and your colleagues write, one of the main aims of Project 2025 is to, quote, end most all of the federal government's efforts to achieve equity and even collect data that could be used to track outcomes across the public and private sectors. That sounds like slightly dense, but explain what it is, because it's a huge deal, right? What you're talking about there.
Yeah, this is a massive, over 900-page document. I wrote about 400 pages.
Right.
So we split it up.
Yeah, for sure.
Across several colleagues. And so, this plan, it proposes to get rid of the Department of Education or to transform it if it can't end it. It would dramatically change how the Justice Department works. And the Justice Department part is related to LGBTQ policy, actually, in terms of whenever Biden's DOJ said that trans minors have a right to gender-affirming care. The way the Project 2025 is written is that it goes through every federal agency and just lays out different proposals, as in we want to get most of the staffers here, or we want to get rid of this department, or ask Congress to do that, or we want to change how it works, or move these different sub areas of these different agencies to other agencies. It's a proposal to restructure of how all of the federal government works, which it can't magically just happen. They need Congress for a lot of it, like we said.
In that quote, you talk about tracking data and outcomes, which is such a big deal for LGBTQ folks. Can you talk a little bit about that change that they would like specifically? They want to erase definitions, right? Even from government documents.
Yes,
Isn't that
and
true?
I'm glad you brought up definitions, because they want to stop collecting a lot of different kinds of data. They want the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to stop collecting employment data based on race and ethnicity, and which also applies to LGBTQ folks. And then for transgender people, it gets more strange. The project equates the act of being transgender as transgender ideology. It equates the act of being transgender or transgender ideology to pornography and declares that it should be outlawed. Right. So the way this project is defining LGBTQ people, it is bizarre to say the least. And so when it's talking about we want to get rid of this data collection for queer people, and the way that it's even defining doing that is very strange. And for more of what you were asking about, the project also suggests that the CDC should stop collecting data on gender identity, because it doesn't believe that gender identity is real. It says that gender identity is an unscientific notion. So it's saying we can't collect this data anymore because we don't believe it's a real thing.
And the implications of that are then you stop providing services, right? Or then those agencies can't act on something that doesn't exist, right? That's the ultimate goal, I guess. You mentioned before the Department of Health and Human Services. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the specific plans there, if you can. I know you write that they want to rename it the Department of Life, which I imagine has to do with abortion. But yeah, go ahead and explain what's going on there.
Right. So with the HHS, Department of Health and Human Services, most of the changes would be about reproductive access to abortion, and it's also about LGBTQ people. And kind of from the really big picture view is this project envisions a federal government that denies that trans people exist, that undermines the rights of same-sex married couples, how they can adopt, how they can have kids, and dismantles services for LGBTQ Americans wherever possible. in pretty broad sweeping scopes. And the parts that I think, like in terms of same-sex married couples, like it would protect adoption and foster care services that refuse to work with LGBTQ plus married couples. And it states that children should be raised by their biological fathers and mothers. And some of that language to me, because it says that, quote, the male-female dyad is essentially human nature. Like some of this, they're not talking about IVF directly, but to me, it's getting into that territory.
Which has become such a big, problem point for the Republicans at the moment, I think, because people are like, what are you talking about? Like banning IVF. Yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah. So sort of in this vein, and you brought this up before too, I'd love to hear specifically about how Project 2025 envisions, we've already said that it imagines that trans people don't exist, but it also has some specific ideas about trans youth and gender affirming care. Obviously, a big state level push has been happening with that over the last couple of years to eliminate that as much as possible or restrict it. Tell us a little bit about their vision of gender affirming care and what they would do to it as much as they could.
The plan wants to cut federal funding for gender affirming care for children and adults. And that's one of the proposals that overlaps with what Trump's own campaign has pledged to do. Trump has said he would terminate Medicare and Medicaid funding for hospitals that provide gender affirming care to trans youth. And there's Trump's own policy proposals. We can talk more about that separately if we want. Yeah. And Project 2025 would also allow more healthcare workers. It would make it easier for healthcare workers to opt out of providing gender affirming care if they say they object to it on religious or moral grounds. And the way that the plan describes gender affirming care for youth, it describes it as a social contagion. And it, broadly speaking, it would make it the federal government's stance that gender affirming care for kids is a social contagion, and the agencies should react appropriately to that as they think of it.
Right. It's sort of like, being someone who sort of works and edits on LGBTQ issues, we're really seeing a distillation here of a lot of themes of the last couple of years, and certainly before the Biden administration was in power, like religious exemptions, social contagion, like all of that stuff has been really distilled down into this dream document of theirs. So that's what, for listeners out there who are sort of remembering those terms and phrases, that's they're bringing them back and they're trying to do it strongly. Before we leave sort of the specifics that we've been talking about, you mentioned the pornography thing. And I think this is it is weird, as you said, but also insidious, like devious move they're making where, like you said, they're sort of wanting to ban pornography in some way, but then they're defining that to include. So could you just underline that again? I know you sort of said it, but I'd love to hear that stated very clearly for our listeners about what do they mean by pornography and what are they going to do with that sort of maneuver?
Right. So thank you for highlighting this, because this is seen by advocates as one of the most extreme proposals in Project 2025.
Yeah.
It's also not clear what they would plan to do after this or how it would be done. This is one of those things advocates told me they would need Congress to do, and legal folks I talked to are skeptical as to how this could be done to equate what they describe it. They don't say transgender people. They say transgender ideology is pornography and it should be outlawed. I'm not personally sure how they would do that. And the folks I've spoken to are also not sure how they would do that. But it is something that's very extreme that we should be paying attention to, especially considering that earlier this year we saw a lot of states put out bills that would keep trans people from participating in public life due to very narrowly defining sex. And, after seeing a lot of those bills failed, but after seeing those bills in which changing the state code to narrowly define sex in ways that would keep trans people out of public life, it would affect driver's license and other areas. When I see something like this, although it's very nebulous and hard to understand how it would work in practice, to me, it would have the same end result of making it hard for trans people to be in public life.
Because presumably, however it was put into power, if it were to succeed, you wouldn't be able to talk about being trans, right? Publicly, for example. It's occurred to me that this very podcast could be considered pornography because we're here talking about these issues, right? So that is, even as it's nebulous, right, as you say, and a little unclear, it is a really scary prospect to me, and definitely something that we should all be paying attention to.
Let's take a quick... You have to do a break.
No. Go ahead.
Just what you just said is so. I appreciate what you just said, and that reminds me that in this plan, the Heritage Foundation recommends that like you just said, this own podcast could be considered that, and there are some examples we can look to in the project. It suggests that educators and public librarians who spread transgender ideology, which we can equate to the concept of being a transgender, they should be registered as sex offenders, and that telecommunications and technology firms who spread these ideas should be shuttered. And that's obviously such a broad reach. So anyway, it relates to what you just said.
Yeah, no, thank you for pointing that out. Absolutely. Let's take a quick break, and then we will be back to talk more with Orion Rummler about Project 2025. All right, we are back. You know, you already started to do this. You sort of pointed out the intersectionality of all of these issues, right? I've been sort of focusing the show a little bit on the LGBT stuff, but that stretches into so many areas here, including reproductive rights, as we've mentioned. Can you think of any other parts of the plan that you've looked at that queer listeners should know about that might not be sort of, you know, obvious under the banner of LGBT, but actually are important to the community?
Yeah, I would say the areas that are targeted on reproductive health, some of it seems very entwined with LGBTQ identities, such as or it could affect anyone who wants to adopt, because it would protect adoption care and foster care services that oppose marriage equality. So if you're looking to adopt from what I would consider a reputable service, like maybe that would be harder. And I think for families, like if you're a parent, there's a lot in this project I think you should read, because a lot of it would affect children outside of LGBTQ areas. Like the Project 2025 believes that the Labor Department should relax restrictions on child labor.
Right.
So if you're a parent, I would read more about this project. There's some information about the project also calls for increased accommodations for working mothers, and they want protections for lactating parents. So there's some areas where they're trying to propose things that benefit parents, then they're also advocating for child labor. So anyway, if you're a parent, I would definitely pay attention to this.
Yeah, that's a really good note. And yeah, listeners, we're only talking about a fraction of things on the show today. So really go read Orion's piece and other pieces. There's a lot out there now, because maybe go read the whole thing because you can download it. I still can't really believe that they like put it out in public. Like I don't know if you have, this is actually maybe a question. I don't know if you have the answer to this or not, or know anything about this, and we can cut it if you don't. But clearly this is going to be unpopular, going to be unpopular with like the majority of Americans. Like, do you have any sense of why they would have made it public? Why not just keep it secret? You know, it's sort of surprising to me that it's even out there.
Yeah, I understand that question, and I don't have any like real reporting to know why this is public. But I mean, based on how I've been covering anti-LGBTQ rhetoric for the past, I have no sense of time, but I've been covering anti-LGBTQ laws and rhetoric for a while. And what we have seen over the past few years is this anti-LGBTQ rhetoric getting more and more blatant and more extreme. And some of my colleagues in the industry have been reporting on things like bathroom bills and have noted like there's not the same sense of outrage that there used to be for things like bathroom bills. And that might be part of the equation, as in maybe folks are desensitized a little bit to anti-LGBTQ extremism.
Right.
Maybe that was part of their thinking on this, but I don't have any reporting to prove that.
Yeah. No, it's fine. We're speculating. That's fine. Yeah, the bathroom bills is a good flag. We just had, for listeners maybe that missed this episode, we had Nico Lang, a great journalist, on here, I don't know when it comes out, but probably a week ago, whenever you hear this, or 2 weeks, about the resurgence of bathroom bills and how, that there's not really the backlash this time. So that's a good one to go listen to if you want a little more context. So we recently started to see Project 2025 appearing, thankfully, like in Democrat speeches. Kamala Harris has been talking about it. And campaign ads, that kind of thing. They're trying to turn it into a motivating issue, which is very smart. I think, it's sitting there and should be And you mentioned this earlier, but I wanted to kind of come back to it. Trump has been trying to distance himself from it. Can you just remind us what's going on there and in maybe a little more detail, and remind us how influential this would or wouldn't be in his administration?
Right. So yes, although Trump has said publicly that he doesn't really know what Project 2025 is, the Times actually did a great layout to show that, based on his previous statements, like he has to be aware of
Sure.
this. And then there's the simple fact that some of the authors in Project 2025 previously worked on Trump's transition team, like transitioning him from the campaign into public office. Also has the former Deputy Associate Attorney General of the Justice Department during Trump's administration helped write this. We have his former Deputy Chief of Staff. Like, we have folks who wrote, like, some of the authors of this worked for Trump previously. And like we talked about before, just because the Heritage Foundation thinks something should happen doesn't mean it will happen, even if Trump were to get into office. But if we look to who's writing this and who would be more likely to work in another Trump administration, I think these proposals should be taken seriously, and we should pay more attention to who's writing it than Trump trying to distance himself from it.
Yeah, that's really smart. If you had to leave our listeners with a sort of takeaway thought about Project 2025, maybe something that they could share with their friends or family, right, that don't know about this yet, to educate and to kind of get people paying attention, what would that be?
It would be that there's what you said earlier. There's so much more to this proposal that we have not covered, and it affects your life even if you think it doesn't. I think, I forget which outlet did this, I think Axios, but there's been, I might be wrong in the outlet, but there's been some coverage about how this proposal would affect the economy, like how it would affect taxes, how it would affect job protections. We just discussed child labor restrictions. This is such a broad-reaching proposal that it would affect everybody in the country.
Yeah, it absolutely would. Well, listeners, if you want to know more about Project 2025, a great place to start is Orion Rummler's article in the 19th. You can search for it under, we'll put it on our show page, of course, but you can search for it under what you need to know about Project 2025. Orion, thank you so much for being here today. This was really informative and I think, eye-opening, and we need to have our eyes opened right now, so thanks. Thank you so much, Bryan. This was great. All right, that is our show for this week. Please send us feedback, advice, questions, and topic ideas to outwardpodcast@slate.com. And remember, as always, that by joining Slate Plus, you'll get ad-free podcasts, extra segments on shows like Working, and you'll never hit a paywall on the Slate site. To learn more about that, you can go to slate.com/outwardplus. Our show is produced by Palace Shaw, whose Project for America is the only one that I want to get behind. If you like Outward, please subscribe in your podcast app, tell your friends about it, and rate and review the show so others can find it. We love 5-star reviews. It's hard to find podcasts these days, so please do that and help us out. Until next week, stay gay, everybody.